You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore ways to deepen bilateral ties between Nigeria and Sweden. You can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also follow my Twitter handle, send your comments and your thoughts to @EstherOAwoniyi. Now, how best can Africa's largest economy and Europe's fifth largest country by land area deepen bilateral ties? Sweden's ambassador to Nigeria, Michael Grans, joins me as we explore areas of collaboration between Nigeria and Sweden. Carl, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
So let's set the ball rolling now. Just help us understand where, in terms of, historically, the relationship between Nigeria and Sweden in terms of bilateral ties. Where are we? How close are those ties at the moment?
I would say that Nigeria is very important to Sweden. It's the biggest country in Africa and it's the biggest market in Africa. So it's both politically and economically, it is important to strengthen our ties, and that's part of our mission at the embassy.
Okay, but I was just wondering, in terms of, yes, size of the country, but from a foreign policy perspective, how important, how strategic is a country like Nigeria to Sweden?
Of course, Nigeria, with the size and the location geographically, it is very important in West Africa. It is a regional superpower and very heavy in organizations such as Ecowas, for instance. So it's important also for security reasons in West Africa, I would say.
Okay, for security, I wanted us to talk about, we could just quickly touch on security, areas of collaboration. How deep is the partnership, perhaps from a donor point of view, and security especially also in the northeastern part of Nigeria?
Well, we think that the humanitarian situation is very much connected to security. If there is a humanitarian need and this is not coped with, there is a risk of a deterioration of security in the region. As you perhaps know, Sweden is a big donor in humanitarian aid to different organizations. And actually, regarding, if we look geographically, the Chad Lake Basin, it's only this year it's $36 million US, and $15 million of these go to northeast Nigeria. So.
Okay, we'll talk about security much later, but I want us to focus on trade and bilateral relations at this point. In terms of the volume of trade between Sweden and Nigeria, just maybe in the last couple of years, what's been the trend? And just help us understand the volume, because many times when I have other ambassadors from other countries here, they often talk about the gap. There's always a gap on one or either side or both sides many times. So, what is the picture between Nigeria and Sweden when it comes to the volume of trade and the gaps we're still seeing?
Well, there is a gap, and in favor of Nigeria because of our imports of crude oil. But there is also a considerable export from Sweden to Nigeria. It's about $100 million US this year, but only 2014 it was 250 million. But the trend is growing. It's more than 50% if you look at the last 6 months. So we would like very much this trend to continue, but also to diversify. And also imports from Nigeria. We love export, but we love imports as well, because this goes together. It's trade.
Absolutely.
So we would like to import other things than oil as well from Nigeria. So diversification of Nigerian economy is crucial.
Let's expand this a little bit. Obviously, you know how the global trade dynamics are changing now with Brexit, the US-China trade spat that continues to linger. And, there's been a lot of literature, a lot of, talk about how those dynamics have changed, globalization, capitalism, and just trade as we know it amongst countries. We've seen a lot of protectionism. The World Trade Organization obviously has its work cut out for it at the moment, but just how that is perhaps, if it is at all, changing trade policy for Sweden, how maybe how that changes how you now engage with certain trade partners, maybe especially here in Africa. With the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that is about to change things significantly for the continent. So how that global trade dynamics are changing the outlook for Sweden?
Well, it's obvious. We see the trends of protectionism around the world. Everybody is following what's going on between the US and China and different customs issues. So Sweden is very much in favor of free trade. Actually, half of our GDP goes on export. So trade is really crucial for us. and we defend free trade wherever we can in the European Union, but also in other organizations. So we're very much in favor of the EPA agreement, for instance, free trade agreements, also within Africa, but also between Ecowas and the EU. So this is a very strong Swedish policy from our side.
Okay. Now, for Nigeria, back to Nigeria, between the trade between Nigeria and Sweden, what would you say is, what's the if there is, the one-stop shop? Is it still the embassy, the Swedish embassy, or is there a Nigeria-Sweden Chamber of Commerce here? Who facilitates all that trade?
Different organizations, but of course the embassy is part of this and perhaps crucial. But then we have Business Sweden. They cover Africa, and we work together with them. They used to have actually an office in Lagos a couple of years ago. We hope it might come back. But then we have direct contacts also with the companies. And the big classical companies are all here. ABB, Swedish-Swiss company. We have Sandvik in mining, for instance. Atlas Copco, the big classical Swedish companies. But other companies as well, other sectors that you might not think of, like Oriflame is a cosmetics.
Cosmetic, yeah.
5 years in Lagos just a couple of weeks ago, and they have more than 40,000, mostly female sellers and consultants.
I'm curious to know the perception of Swedish business in way for those who perhaps two parts to this question: those who are already here, and those Swedish businessmen who are thinking, or businesswomen also who are thinking about coming to do business here in Nigeria. What is the perception now in terms of what they expect or what they think the business environment is like, and whether or not they consider Nigeria, the Nigerian market, a good place to invest?
First of all, the market is huge. We must remember that more than 100 million internet users in this country. So it has its challenges. We all know that can be difficult to make business.
But are there specific questions that they ask the embassy? They ask you in terms of, okay, we're coming to Nigeria. You want us to come to Nigeria. You want to perhaps do a roadshow or some collaborative conversations or whatever. Tell us, what is it like to do business in Nigeria? What do you tell them? What does the embassy tell them?
I've been here for 4 weeks. So
what would the embassy tell? I mean, what would you tell a potential Swedish business coming to Nigeria?
That they should see the potential in this country and the region. And if you can do business in Nigeria, it can spread all over West Africa. So it's really the main market to conquer. But you have to know the market, and I think that most Swedish also businessmen and businesswomen don't know very much. So it's also a question of marketing the market of Nigeria in Sweden. And we do that. We work not only to promote Swedish exports, but also to help Nigerians to export to Sweden. That's what I said in the beginning. We like imports
what's it like on the Nigerian side, taking the exports to Sweden? I mean, what's it like for the Nigerian business people?
Well, in terms
of helping them facilitate.
Yes. For instance, we are making workshops, or actually the Swedish National Board of Trade is coming to Lagos and to Abuja to have workshops in the coming months. And that is to help Nigerian companies and to raise awareness among Nigerian companies how to do business with the EU and Sweden. Rules and procedures, could even be barriers to trade addressed so that we can promote trade in both directions.
But could you, in terms of those barriers, what would you say those barriers are?
I'm not saying there are any barriers, but there could be.
There could be barriers, okay.
But in these kinds of workshops, you find out and you learn about how to make business with the other country. And it's really beneficial. It's mutual all the time. I think that's crucial in trade.
For that business person who's out there watching now and saying to himself, okay, what does Sweden have to offer Nigeria in terms of perhaps across the sectors? What is your value proposition, your selling point, or that your competitive advantage, perhaps in the area of product or service?
Well, of course, Sweden is a small country in Northern Europe. We're about 10 million people, but we have big companies and we have new, smaller startups very much into innovation. And as you know, perhaps Stockholm is number 2 in the world after Silicon Valley when it comes to unicorns, $1 billion startups quite impressive, I think. I think that ICT is obvious. We have Ericsson, the huge company, but lots of smaller companies coming on the side of Ericsson, so to speak. And it could be startups as well. So ICT, and we have this Nigeria Digital Economy Summit coming up in November, hosted by the presidency and the Minister of Trade and Investment in Nigeria. And Sweden is a partner country in this. So that's one area for us to show what we can offer. But then you have smart cities, transport, renewable energy.
But in terms of how that can foster collaborations here in Nigeria, I don't know, maybe you could just paint like a typical scenario how that could happen. Help, because Nigeria, obviously, we're still trying to deepen broadband penetration, and obviously we have a huge mobile use population here. But in terms of broadband, the digital economy is still basically still trying to pick up. But obviously, Sweden is a leader in that regard. So I'm just wondering, in terms of possible collaborations. You also talk about using innovations, ICT, to build smart, sustainable cities. That's a conversation we're also having here in Nigeria. We're seeing rapid urbanization, and of course, going into the future, we need to change the way we live, the kind of houses and kind of cities that we live in. So obviously, there's an opportunity here for Nigeria. So, but then how is Sweden? How are you planning to take advantage of that?
Well, to show our companies, actually, and to make them come. And that was, in the beginning, I said that a lot of Swedes don't know very much about West Africa. So that's the first step, actually, to make promotion about the market and try to help to inform, but also to attract Swedish companies that could, and have this cooperation, not only between businesses, but also between academia. For instance, Ideon in Lund, there's a science park. They have a cooperation with the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. And let's not forget that research is often the beginning of innovation. And then comes innovation, and then comes enterprising, entrepreneurship, and companies grow out of it.
So is it going to come in form of donations, grants? How is that going to work? The collaboration on the academic side. I know you mentioned research. So is it like an exchange program?
That's an exchange program, and usually between two organizations that go together themselves. We can try to facilitate, and that's the mission of the embassy, to matchmake sometimes, so to make people meet. But then they have to get together themselves and make a cooperation and memorandum of understanding or something. Okay,
Carl, we're just going to pause at this time. We'll take a short break and come back and continue from where we left off. If you're just joining us, Carl Michael Grans, Sweden's ambassador to Nigeria, is with me today, and we're talking about deepening bilateral ties between both countries. Carl, thank you for your time so far. Let's get back to you. I did mention that we're going to go back to security and just talk about also the humanitarian efforts on the part of Sweden. What we hear many times, or what we're seeing happening, is we see donor fatigue, happening. We see, stability in the northeast. The border between Cameroon, Chad, Nigeria, Niger, obviously very important because of, we still see militancy, Boko Haram, and all of that. How do you perceive for Sweden in terms of how concerned you are, and if you think that we're seeing enough effort, especially amongst the countries who have who have those borders, back to back? What are your thoughts on that in terms of how the situation has been handled?
Well, as you said, many countries have borders across. It's really cross-border issue and international issue in that way, or regional, cross-regional, I would say. We are quite concerned from Sweden that the humanitarian aid doesn't get access. This goes together, of course, with the security situation in different parts, and we understand that each city in northeast Nigeria, for instance, cannot be secured, but still it has to go hand in hand with humanitarian aid, and we have humanitarian law, which is international and should be held apart from politics. So you quite often end up in this discussion, who's a terrorist and who's not. But according to humanitarian aid, everybody is a human being. women and children in certain areas where there is a humanitarian crisis. So it's very important for us that the different organizations, could be Doctors Without Borders or CEDA, for instance, the Swedish International Development Agency, and others, so many, get access to the people who are really in need.
On the other side of the divide is, the actual terrorism that's happening. The terrorists, and from time to time, sometimes we hear that Nigeria appears to be winning the war against terrorism. Other times, it doesn't appear that we are. But if there's one thing that analysts continue to tell us, that this may be something that has come to stay. It's not just Nigeria. Countries across the globe also. Some countries across the globe are also experiencing it. But in terms of being able to manage and contain it at every point in time, what are your hopes in terms of how you see Nigeria being able to just contain it at least, even if we do not get to completely eradicate it?
Well, we think that containment is not enough. You have to go to the roots of the problems, and that is actually poverty and problems within
unemployment
different
and all of that, yeah.
Unemployment, no economic growth. It's classical, and it's in many countries. It's not only Nigeria. It's not a Nigerian problem. It's everywhere. But if you don't, people will get into despair, and they will turn to Boko Haram and other organizations. So you have to go really to the roots. And if people are doing well, they can go to school, they have food to eat, they can develop a small business, they won't be attracted by terrorism and extremist organization.
Absolutely. Now, I know that you mentioned diversification. That's one thing that the Nigerian economy, the Nigerian government is seeking to do, and agriculture is at the forefront of that. I know that,
very important.
Technology from Sweden, I know you've been able to, you've done big things in that regard. I'm just wondering, is there any way Sweden can plug into Nigeria's agricultural transformation agenda, perhaps using technology as a driving force?
Yes, I think so. We have an example, for instance, Arla, that is a Swedish-Danish company, and they have a cooperation in Kaduna with 1,000 farmers to get proper land and secure their livelihoods and the livestock and water. And that is, of course, to engage and make a kind of startup for them to expand into business and producing milk and dairy products that you don't have to import anymore. You can produce it locally or regionally or nationally in Nigeria. Then we're back to this diversification of the economy. So there you have, it's humanitarian in a way, but it's also business and help others. So it goes both ways.
But when you think about how a couple of other African countries are also embarking on that, because obviously those countries who were resource dependent are now having to actually look inwards and realize that they can no longer be subject to the shocks, at the international markets where these commodities are traded, and just being tossed here and there by market forces. Oil is one of such, and that is why Nigeria, as you know, is diversifying away. But when you think about the efforts that you see perhaps across the continent, does that make you optimistic in terms of how Africa can begin to feed itself and just solve its problems, African solutions to African problems?
Yes,
you buy into
African solutions to African problems. But then we can help, and it's also mutual, as I said. It's not only Sweden helping Nigeria, but if we go together and there's a huge, young, talented population in this country, they're more and more digitalized. So there is a positive potential of developing this country so that it can have its own growth. Everything's there, actually. Land and waters and oil, that we don't have any oil, but you should diversify, and then we will be happy to trade in both directions.
Okay. Now, you've been ambassador for a couple of weeks now?
4 weeks.
Yes, you're new in Nigeria. Talk to us about your plan, strategy in terms of how, I know we've talked a lot about, trade, and obviously that is perhaps one of your key mandates, matchmaking companies, ensuring that, those ties, bilateral ties are strengthened. But just, for you, for your office, what plans have you laid out?
Of course, trade is one thing, but we also have other missions, and culture and civil society is one of them. I see the embassy a little bit as a matchmaking area to make people meet. It could be In music, there's a huge interest in Afrobeats in Sweden, for instance.
Oh, really?
Sabina Dumba, one of the Swedish female singers, she had a big single with Mr. Easy, for instance.
Okay.
And there are cross connections. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is quite well known in Sweden. There was one project with her in Stockholm, giving her book, We Shall All Be Feminists, to all 16-year-olds in Sweden, in all schools.
Oh, wow.
It was a huge project together with her. That's literature, but that's also feminism and gender equality.
Speaking about gender, sorry to butt in. Speaking about gender, I know that is one thing Sweden has been very successful at doing. Ensuring gender equality, women's rights is just so huge in Sweden. I'm curious to know, how did it all start? How were you able to get to where you are right now in terms of making sure that women have not just a voice, but are actually seen as equals across the board? And just maybe some actionable points or some lessons that Nigeria can learn in that regard.
I would say it took some time. Actually, it's 100 years this year since women got the right to vote in Sweden. So there has been a development in Sweden, like in every country. But it's true, as you say, that we are at the forefront today. But there has been a struggle, I think, and it develops step by step. But I think that education is very important when you start at school to get certain values, and gender equality is about equality. Gender is one thing, but we have other equalities as well. You start thinking of it, and I think that law making has been also a process step by step, and it goes hand in hand with society. Society develops, and so does.
But do you think that because what we've seen on the African continent, because we keep having conversations about empowering women, how you're actually better off empowering women because there's that a better economic ripple effect because a woman is more likely to spend more on her household, compared to the conversations about land titles, restrictions being relaxed and women being given land, and I don't know, just in terms of how that. I mean, thinking about that for you, I mean, what comes to mind for you in terms of is it more political will that's lacking?
There has to be political will, but there's also an economic drive force. I mean, Sweden is quite a rich country, but we would never have been without half of the population. Women contribute to our GDP, and without them, we would have lost half of our potential, and we would have been half as rich as a country. So it's not only just for women and equality, it's also smart to develop the countries economically, and from there you can take other steps as well in developing your society. If you have money, you have the access to other reforms as well. So it goes hand in hand, but
Absolutely. Another issue I wanted to quickly just talk to you about is you probably, the youth population on the African continent, the potential. We keep talking about the youth demographic dividend of Africa. That's the youth. I mean, by the year 2050, we're told that more than half of the continent will be youth under the age of 30 or something, young basically, and that is a potential that needs to begin to be tapped right now. Just in terms of how, what that means to you in terms of when you think about it, when a country like Sweden thinks about it, what comes to mind for you in terms of how where we are or maybe not at the moment, taking the necessary steps, preparations needed to ensure that when we get to 2050, the jobs are going to be available. We're going to have the smart cities, and of course, the sustainable development goals also thrown into that mix. Just your thoughts on that.
Well, of course, these figures are huge. It's a democratic challenge for Nigeria, and I think that I would like to come back to school, where it all starts. And if you look at the figures, the number of young girls that do not have access to school, especially in northern and northeastern Nigeria, that is a problem. Because education for all, and for girls especially, will change the rest, I would say. Then you can decide on your own, decide for your own body, decide for your future, for your economy, and then you make your own choices. And that will canalize a development in the right direction. We usually say that if there's no gender equality, there will be no sustainability. Simple.
That's a nice way to put it. I like that. Carl, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure having you on Beyond Markets
Thank
today.
you.
I've been speaking to Carl Michael Grans, Sweden's ambassador to Nigeria, and we've been talking about deepening ties between Sweden and Nigeria. Well, that's our show on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. But remember that you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can send your thoughts, your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.